She was 29, and 6 men in a testing room had just decided she was the reason a harbor cable failed. Her brass key tapped, and across the dry floor the receiver answered, every mark readable. Then they lowered that same coil into the stone tank. As the water closed over the bend, the marks went thin, then ragged, then stopped. Roderick Shaw put one finger on her joint and called the work ruined. A man by the door laughed. Clara Whitcombe walked out with no wages, no reference, and no shop on the river willing to write her name. She had one thing of her own, a brass telegraph key on a cord under her apron, given to her by a man 8 years dead. 6 weeks later, a creditor's agent handed her 45 days in a foreclosed cable works nobody would bid on. But what Shaw did not know was that behind the stone tank, on the last drum in the yard, sat something no auctioneer thought worth carting away, and it would decide whose names went into the books along that reach. Clara Whitcombe had learned her trade in the smell of warm gutta percha, and in 8 years not one line of what she knew had ever been written down under her own name. The harbor order went out on the 9th of April, 600 yards of armored signaling cable for a breakwater station on the south coast, and Clara asked for the immersion book 2 days before it was drummed. Rush jobs were where the small sins hid. The book came out of the office with the page already filled in. Every section showed a reading, and every reading was signed by a supervisor named Hollis, who had been in Deptford on at least one of those dates. Clara stood with her thumb on the column and tried to remember one morning that spring when she had seen the tank filled and a coil going into it and could not. The dry test carries, Shaw told her. 600 yards is a river job, not the Atlantic. It talks, it goes. The drum went out on the 11th and the cable was laid on the 22nd. It worked 9 days. Then the marks at the shore office began to fail whenever the tide came up, and within a week, the station could get nothing through at all. Shaw held his inquiry in the testing room, which was a clever place to hold it. He had the failed length hauled back and laid across the floor, dry, and it talked beautifully. Then it went in the water and it died, and every man there could see that the only thing anybody had touched with his hands was the joint, and the hands had been hers. He kept back her wages, 18 shillings and a half week owing, against what he called damages, and wrote to 2 other shops on the river. By the end of May, a foreman at Woolwich told her plainly that he would not take her on at any wage because a name follows a fault. What stayed with her was the copper. When they cut the cable open at the joint, the 7 wires inside were bright and unbroken, exactly as she had left them. She reached for a knife to strip the coating back along the length beside it, and Shaw took the knife out of her hand. The notice went up on the gate in the 2nd week of June. The note holders had taken the works, and the fixed plant was to be sold for scrap in July unless a better offer came in writing. She waited 2 hours on a bench outside the creditor's agent's office in Bermondsey. Ambrose Lyle was in his early 50s, gray at the temples, with a habit of writing while he listened. She told him what the scrap merchants would pay for a boiler of that age and for a line shaft that would have to be cut into lengths to leave the building, and she was close enough on both numbers that he stopped writing. "And your figure," he said. "An accepted cable. 1 order, 600 yards, harbor work. A signed acceptance from a buyer's engineer is worth more to your note holders than the iron, and it leaves you a working property instead of an empty shed." Scrap was a known small sum, an operating works an unknown larger one, and he was paid to recover as much as he could. The license ran 45 days from the 20th of June. Possession, the fixed machinery, whatever help she could hire at her own risk. She could sell nothing bolted down, and if she had no buyer's acceptance certificate by noon on the 4th of August, the sale went forward and she gave up the key without argument. She signed it. She had £11 and 4 shillings in a tin under the floor of her room in Deptford, and she counted it twice that night, wrote the sum inside the cover of a receipt book in pencil, and tied the tape again. Inside, the work smelled of cold iron and old tar. Half the Northlight panes were gone, so the pigeons had been in, and weeds had come up between the trolley rails in the drum yard. Past the loading doors, the timber and iron stage went out over black mud. The failed coil was still there. Nobody had bid on it. It sat on a drum at the yard end, worth nothing as cable, and not enough as scrap to pay the cartage. "You have bought yourself the privilege of proving me right." Shaw had come in through the yard gate behind her, and he put his hand flat on the drum as he passed it, the way a man touches a horse he used to own. 45 days, you will get the boiler lit, and you will make something that talks on the floor, and then it will go in the water. I have watched that happen once already." She did not answer him. When he had gone, she took the brass key out from under her apron on its cord. Elias Croft had given it to her in the winter of 1870, on the day he came back from the doctor and did not say what he had been told. He was 61. He put it in her hand and said one thing: "A test you did not watch is a story somebody told you." 9 weeks later, he was dead, and the key stayed under her apron for 8 years, because there was no book in that building she was allowed to sign. Here is the thing to hold on to, because everything that follows turns on it. That cable had an unbroken copper road running the whole 600 yards, and a message could travel it all day on a dry floor. Put it in water, and the message leaked away. Nothing was cut. The question was never whether the metal was whole. It was where the message was escaping through the walls, and Clara had 45 days to find a hole nobody had ever been able to see. The inventory told her what she had. The boiler had been cold since March, but the tubes were sound. One of the 3 coating dies was scored down its bore, a bright, dragged line she could feel with a fingernail. The stone tank held a foot of rainwater with a dead pigeon in it. In the testing room, the leads had gone green at the terminals, and the small, removable shunt that belonged with the galvanometer was not in its case, and not in any drawer. The pattern books were gone from the office shelf, and 2 of the cleanest ledgers with them. What was left was the old production book, the material dockets in a tin box, and the immersion book signed by Hollis. She hired 3 people that week. Thomas Priest was 48, Welsh, a jointer and armoring foreman whose right hand had been crushed under a drum years before and never come right. He did not want to be led by her and said so at the gate. He would open that joint himself, he said, before he took her money. Isaac Fenner was 57, careful in a way that had cost him something, and he had run the testing room until Shaw closed it. He looked at the green terminals and said he would need new leads, sal ammoniac for the cells, and 2 days. Nell Kirby was 19, out of the bobbin room, and she had spent 3 years being told her memory was handy. She could name which drum had carried which lot that spring, without notes. They lit the boiler on the 23rd. Before the steam came up, they turned the line shaft over by hand, and nothing was seized. They scraped the joining tables to clean wood and scrubbed the tank out with lime and river sand. Clara bought a ruled ledger for 2 shillings and 6 pence and drew the columns herself. Section number, material lot, date, hour, reading, and a narrow column for initials. Every entry was to carry the initials of whoever had made the observation with their own eyes. Nell wrote hers that first afternoon, small and careful, and then looked at it as though it might be rubbed out. Going through the compound store with Nell calling numbers, Clara turned up a barrel with the right lot mark for the failed order. She tipped it. There was a skin of hardened compound in the bottom, 1/4 of an inch, and nothing else. She stood it back up, wrote the lot number and the date in the new book, and put her own initials beside it. Isaac had the testing room working by the 27th. When he could not find the shunt that belonged to the galvanometer, he wound a substitute out of German silver wire, bought for 4 shillings. It was not as good as the proper one, but good enough to compare one thing against another. Thomas opened the joint on the 28th. In daylight, with Nell writing, he cut the coating back well clear on both sides, got down to the copper without hurrying, then stood and looked at the union a long while. It is a good joint. Wires laid true, no nick on the strand, the shoulder even both ways. I have made worse and been paid for it. Whatever killed this cable, it was not this. Nell wrote it in the ledger with the hour, and Thomas put his initials in the last column, the first time he had ever signed anything in that building. They rebuilt the joint, laid the length dry across the coating floor, and Clara pressed her key. The receiver answered, mark after mark, clean the whole way. They lifted the coil into the tank at 11 in the morning. For a minute or two, nothing happened. Then the needle began to walk. Not a jump, not a break, but a slow, patient drift, current going somewhere it had no business going, and the marks at the receiver softened and thickened and turned into a smear nobody could read as a word. Clara had them take it out, wind it on a smaller former, and put it back. Tighter bend. The needle went further and faster. The tighter it was bent, the worse it leaked. Samuel Reed came down on the 2nd of July, which was day 34. He was about 40, plain dressed, sent by the South Coast Harbor Telegraph Company to find 600 yards of armored cable for a breakwater station, and he had already been to 2 larger shops that were full until autumn. Clara explained the fault in about 6 sentences and watched him decide she was hiding something. She had done it again, given him the end of the reasoning and none of the road. You are telling me the copper is fine. I am telling you the copper is fine and the insulation is not. And those are 2 different tests. And this shop only ever ran the easy one. That is an accusation about a man who is not here. It is a statement about a cable, that is. Reed took out a notebook. Then here is what I will do. 600 yards, 3 shillings a yard, 30 pounds advanced against material, the balance on my acceptance. Acceptance means this. The core goes in the water before any armor goes on it, coiled to the radius I give you, and it stays 12 hours while a reading is taken every hour and written down. After the armor, and after it is drummed, it goes in again and holds, and I will not sign alone. Somebody else who was in the room signs beside me. Agreed. He left the drawing of the bend radius on the table, and Nell copied it into the ledger and initialed it. 30 pounds bought copper wire, 200 weight of gutta percha in sheet, compound, coal at 19 shillings a ton, and a week of wages with something left over. It did not buy time, and time was what pushed Clara into the mistake. She had been going over the failed length inch by inch with a lens, and about 4 feet beyond the joint she found a place where the outer coat looked wrong. Slightly duller, faintly paler, an irregularity she could catch with her thumbnail. It was the only visible defect on the whole run, and it sat close to the joint. She decided it was a wound, a place where the coating had been damaged in handling, thin enough to let water through and not thin enough to see from 6 feet away. So they repaired it. They warmed the section, cut the outer material back to what looked like clean stuff, laid on fresh compound, and built the coating up again with the care that length had never had. It took 2 days and material she could not spare. They tested it dry that evening, and the receiver hammered out every mark like new. Nell laughed out loud. Isaac said it was the best signal that instrument had given in 2 years. And for the first time since June, somebody talked about saving part of the old core and selling it as a spare length. The letter came next morning from a solicitor in Gracechurch Street, claiming the pattern books, the process books, and 1 set of coating dies as the personal property of Roderick Shaw. Lyle read the license, looked at the dies, and told Clara that on the dies the man was right. The new ledger was hers, he said, and Shaw had no claim on it at all. She gave up the dies. That left her the scored one, and she spent most of a day dressing it out by hand with a scraper and oil, checking the bore against a sample every 20 minutes until the drag line stopped printing itself on the coating. That evening she went over the section again with the lens, because she went over everything twice now. The pale mark was still there, not where she had patched it, past it, fainter and thinner, running away from the repair in both directions, further than she had cut. She told herself it was staining from the warm iron, put the lens down, and went home. Reed came back on the 5th of July with a pocket watch and no small talk. They laid the repaired length dry first. Clara pressed her key, and the receiver beat out the whole test line without one doubtful mark, and Reed listened with his head slightly turned, the way a man listens to an engine. Good, now bend it. They wound it onto the former at the radius he had drawn, tighter than Clara would have chosen and exactly what a drum would do to it, and lowered the coil into the tank, while Isaac watched the needle and Nell stood at the ledger with the pen already wet. Nothing happened. A minute, 2, 5. The needle sat where it belonged, and the receiver kept talking, and Thomas, who had not said one encouraging word since the day he was hired, put both hands on the rim of the tank and leaned over the water. At 7 minutes, Isaac said, "It is moving." He said it quietly, the way you say a thing you hope you would not have to say. At 9 minutes, the marks began to thicken. At 11, they stuttered. At a little past 13, the instrument was still moving, and what it made no longer meant anything at all. Reed closed his watch. That is the same fault. Whatever you mended, it was not that. The order stood because he still had no cable, and the 12-hour immersion would not be shortened for anybody's difficulty. 4 days were gone, and so was compound she had bought with money she did not have. Thomas said what he had been holding since the beginning. Leave the old length. It is dead. Put every hour we have left on the order and let the joint argue for itself. The order will not clear my name. No, but it will keep the roof on. Clara turned to the ledger to check the time of the first movement of the needle and found Nell had written about 7 minutes in the hour column. She heard her own voice before she knew she had started. She said that about was the word that had put her name on a failed cable, that this book was the only thing in the building worth anything, that a reading nobody could stand behind was a reading nobody had taken. Nell stood with the pen in her hand and did not answer, and did not look away either, and went red from the collar up. Clara stopped in the middle of a sentence. She had heard that speech before, in that room, from Shaw. "Nell, that was wrong of me, I am sorry." She took the pen and wrote in the margin, in her own hand, that the first needle movement was her observation and not Miss Kirby's, that she had failed to call the hour aloud when it happened, and that the fault in the record was her own. Then she put her initials beside it, the first time those letters appeared in that column, and left the word about where it stood, because rubbing it out would have been a lie of a smaller kind. Nell said nothing then. 2 days later, she began calling readings aloud on her own, in a clear, flat voice that carried the length of the shed. That evening, Clara cut the repaired section open while it was still warm. She knew what a punctured coating looked like, a stain crossing the wall from outside to copper, like a nail hole. That was not what was there. The copper was dry, the inner coat was dry, but between the second coat and the third, where 2 layers of gutta percha should have been made into one body of material, there was a fine, bright line of water lying along the length of the cable, running out of the cut in both directions like water in a groove. It was not crossing the wall. It was traveling along inside it. She called the others over and showed them, and said nothing clever, because she did not yet know what it meant. She found out over the next 3 days, by taking apart the one thing she had been protecting. She had them strip the old core, not 4 feet, not 10, but 60 feet, past the joint in both directions, sacrificing length Thomas still believed could be sold. Layer by layer they came to the join between the second and third coatings, and it came apart under a blunt tool almost without resistance. In a sound cable, those 2 coats are one thing, and you have to cut them apart. In this one, they lifted whole and clean, and the faces of them were dull and pale, where they should have been dark and glossy. The seam did not begin at her joint. It ran up to her joint and past it, 31 feet on one side and better than 20 on the other, and her joint sat in the middle of it like a knot in a rope that had been badly made along its whole length. Nell brought the books over the same evening. She had been through the immersion book for that lot 4 times, and what she had noticed was not a number. It was ink. 3 pages carried the same small blot in the same position at the head of the column, the kind a pen makes when it is filled and set down in a hurry, and the intervals between the readings were identical to the minute all the way down. You cannot take 9 readings a day and have them fall on the same minutes 3 days running, she said. That is a copy. Somebody wrote 3 days at one sitting. Isaac put his hand on the dates and went still. The tank was empty that week. They had the sluice out to reset the stone, and it was dry to the bottom until the Friday. I remember because I asked when it would be back and was told to mind my own end of the shop. He looked at Clara. There was no water in this building on any of those 3 days. Nobody immersed anything. The last piece was in the tin box, and it took Clara most of the night to find. A supplier's docket, dated the 29th of March, for 2 barrels of bonding compound. The production book of Shaw, in the same week, entered 4 as consumed against the harbor lot. By morning she had it whole, and wrote it out in the new ledger in plain sentences anyone could read aloud. Between every 2 coats of insulation there must be a thin layer of warm compound, and its whole job is to make the coats into one body. If the compound is short, or too cool, or laid on dirty material by men being shouted at to go faster, the coats sit against each other without ever joining. From outside the cable looks finished. Dry, it will talk all day. Then you wind it round a drum. The bend pulls the 2 coats apart along that unjoined face, no more than a hair, and opens a road inside the insulation that runs the length of the cable. Put it in the sea and water walks along that road. It never has to cut through the wall. It is already inside it, and the current goes out into the water through what is left. And a patch on the outside, clean and careful and warm, 4 days of work and half her compound, stops nothing at all, because the road runs past it in both directions. On the 14th of July, there were 21 days left, and Clara stopped trying to save anything. The old core went back on its drum as evidence. Every hour and every ounce of material after that morning went into 600 yards of new cable, and the way they made it was the argument. They stranded the conductor at the river end, 7 copper wires laid up true, and Clara went over the finished strand herself before it went near heat. Then it was cleaned. That sounds like nothing. It was the part Shaw had treated as nothing, and the part she would not move on. Clean cloths, changed often. Trays covered between operations. Nobody handled prepared copper after touching coal, and she sent a man back to the soap twice on the first day in front of everybody, which was unpleasant and worked. The first coat went on warm through the dye she had dressed by hand, the copper running dead center, and out into the cooling trough, where she cut the sample end, turned it under the lens, and read the wall thickness all the way round. Then the compound. Properly warm, off a pot kept at heat, and not one that had been standing, brushed thin and even, and the core taken through while it was still willing to bond, and the second coat pressed over it before the first could go cold. 4 coats in all, 4 beddings of compound between them, and after each one the sample end was cut and written down. Nell called the lot number of every barrel and every sheet aloud as it went into the work. Isaac ran the readings. The book filled up with initials. Twice that week, the boiler dropped pressure in the afternoon and they lost the coating, because you cannot run the work on falling heat. On the 18th, she cut a sample, and the copper was riding off center. Not badly. The wall was thinner on one side than the other by about the width of a thick thread. It was 11 yards of finished core. She had the whole 11 yards cut out and thrown in the scrap bin in front of the 6 people working that floor, and made Nell enter it as rejected, with the reason and her own initials on the line. Thomas argued with her about it afterward, quietly, because 11 yards was 11 yards and they were making 600. A thin wall is exactly what nobody could see in the other one, she said. That is not the same fault. No, but it is the same bargain. He let it go. Next morning, he came in early and rebuilt the run-out supports at the armoring cage, packing them with blocks and a bolted strap so he could steer the work with his forearm and let the machine take the weight his right hand could not. He had been doing that job by hurting for 3 weeks. He worked better after it and stopped going gray in the face by 4. Clara took on 2 more that week. Hester Vance, 38, 10 years of handwork behind her, on preparing and kneading material. Mary Doyle, 26, on the covered trays and the sample cutting. They went into the book by name and by task, at the rate the work was worth, which was not the rate women were being paid up and down that reach for standing at a bobbin. The first numbered length of core went into the tank on the 21st of July at 6 in the morning, coiled to the radius from Reed, and stayed 12 hours. Isaac took a reading on the hour. Nell called each one aloud and wrote it, and whoever stood at the tank at that minute put their initials in the last column. The needle sat still at 6 and at noon and at 6 in the evening. 12 readings. No drift, no walk. Clara stood at the tank for the last 3 hours and did nothing useful because she could not make herself go and do something else. They tested 5 numbered sections that way. Then the tar jute went on as bedding, and then the iron armor, 12 wires laid round the core with Thomas watching the pressure, because armor put on too hard will crush the insulation it is there to protect, and nobody will know until the thing is at the bottom of a harbor. On the 26th of July, with 9 days left, the cable was made, drummed, and connected, and Roderick Shaw made his move. He went to the note holders with ready money, enough to take the paper off them at once against a debt that would otherwise take a court and a summer, on one condition. Possession passed to him immediately. He also began to talk, in the yards and the offices, in the back room of a public house where the buyer's men drank. He did not say Clara was a bad worker. He said she had gifted hands and poor judgment, and that no company engineer would put his name to an acceptance certificate resting on the certification of a woman who had already caused one failure. That one traveled. Reed heard it from a clerk in his own company before Clara heard it at all. On the evening of the 3rd of August, the night before the test, Isaac went into the testing room to set up and came out again in about a minute. The comparative circuit had been remade. Not smashed, not obviously wrecked, but remade. 2 connections moved at the terminal board in a way that would have shown a false steadiness on one branch and a wandering needle on the other, and any man who did not take the board apart first would have trusted it. The German silver shunt he had wound himself was gone out of its case. That is not a thief, Isaac said. A thief takes the battery. That is somebody who knows exactly which piece of this makes the 2 coils comparable. Shaw arrived at 8 the next morning with a cart, and on it the old failed coil kept back from the inquiry 4 months. You have made a cable, he said pleasantly, in front of Lyle and 11 of the workforce. Then let it be tested beside the one this shop made before, in the same water, on the same day. If your process is different, the water will say so. He believed it would go the other way, and that was the whole of his mistake. He had spent 4 months telling the story in which the difference between the 2 cables was the joint of one woman. Lyle took out the license and read the date aloud. Noon today. The test is specified by Mr. Reed, or the sale proceeds this afternoon. They had until noon and no shunt. Isaac and Clara took the board apart on the testing room floor, with Shaw sitting on the crane base outside in the sun. They put every connection back and checked it twice. Then Isaac worked out what they could do without the shunt. Not a fine measurement, but a comparison. 1 battery, 1 instrument, 1 set of leads. Each coil connected in turn, in the same water, at the same bend, for the same interval, in plain sight of everybody round the tank, and nothing changed between the two runs except which cable was on the end of the wires. It was crude, and it was completely fair, and it exposed her new cable exactly as much as his old one. "If yours drifts," Isaac said, "there will be 40 people watching it drift." "I know." They ran it at 11:30, in the open, with the loading doors pushed back so that the tank and the wharf were one room. Reed was there with his watch, Lyle with the license folded in his coat. Two of the note holders had come down, the workforce stood along the wall, and Shaw stood at the head of the tank where he could see the needle. 40 yards off the stage, a barge lay moored with a receiving instrument on a crate and a man named Alfred Muir, 33, beside it with a pencil and a sheet of paper. "Dry first, both cables." The old coil was laid along the boards and connected, and Clara pressed her key, and the receiver on the barge answered every mark, and Muir held up the paper so they could see he had it. There was a small sound from the men along the wall. It was exactly what had happened in April. Then her new cable, dry, did the same. "Now the water," Reed said. The old coil went first, wound to the radius on the drawing, lowered until it was covered, connected to the one battery through the one instrument. Isaac called the time. Nell wrote it. At 4 minutes, the needle began to walk. It was not dramatic, and that was what made it terrible for Shaw. It was the same slow, patient drift she had watched in June and in April, current going out through the walls of a cable that was not cut anywhere. At 7 minutes, Muir stood up on the barge and called that the marks had gone soft, and at 10 that he had nothing worth writing down. They lifted it out and dried the leads. Nothing else on that stage was touched, and every man there could see it. Then her cable went into the same water, at the same bend, on the same wires. Reed watched the needle himself for the first 4 minutes. At 10 minutes, it had not moved. At 15, it had not moved. At 20, with the shed silent, Reed said, "Send." Clara took the brass key out from under her apron, set it on the crate, and sent the line they had agreed. Blackwall Reach to barge. Cable accepted or not accepted, as read. Muir wrote it, sent it back word for word, then stood and read it aloud across the water. After that, the rest took perhaps a quarter of an hour, and it was all paper and material. Thomas laid the opened old joint on a board and said what he had said in June, that it was sound both ways, and that he had signed his name to it in a book on the 28th. Nell put the immersion book down open at the 3 copied pages, the same blot in the same place, and the readings falling on the same minutes 3 days running, and beside it, the docket for 2 barrels of compound and the production book that swore to 4. Isaac said the tank had been dry that week with the sluice out and no coil had gone into it, and signed a statement to it on the spot, which cost him something because he had kept quiet about that tank for 4 months to hold on to a job he had already lost. Then Clara put the stripped length of the old core on the table and turned back the 2 coats with her fingers, and they came apart like 2 sheets of paper laid together, dull and pale, where they should have been one body of material. "There is nothing wrong with the metal in this cable," she said. "There never was. The message never had to cross a hole in the wall. The wall itself was made in 2 pieces that were never joined, and when you bend it round a drum, it opens a road inside the insulation. Water walks along that road, and the message goes out into the sea. You cannot mend it from outside, because the road runs past your mend." She turned the length over. "It runs 31 feet on this side of my joint and 22 on the other. My joint took 1 afternoon in April. This was made along the whole length, in the coating, before I ever touched it." Reed asked 2 questions, both about the 12-hour readings, then took out his pen and signed the acceptance certificate on the crate beside the key, and Lyle signed under him as the second witness. Shaw stayed to the end. There was no way to leave that was not worse than staying. When it was over, he said something to Lyle about his offer for the note, and Lyle answered him in front of everybody that a works with a signed acceptance and a repeat order in hand was worth more to his people running than sold, and the offer was declined. Shaw went out through the yard gate and did not put his hand on the drum as he passed it. The balance came to 60 pounds, and Reed left a deposit against a second cable of 800 yards for the same station to be delivered in October. On that, Lyle turned the 45-day license into a 5-year lease with an option to purchase out of profits. It was not generosity. It was the arrangement that paid his note holders best. 12 people came back on the books by the end of August. 6 were women, entered by name and by task, in preparation, numbering, observation, and inspection, at the rate the work was worth. That was 12 people in one shed on one reach of one river, and it did not settle anything beyond the gate. Clara Whitcombe was 29 years old. In June, she had £11 and 4 shillings in a tin under a floor in Deptford. No wages owed to her that she would ever see, and no shop on the river willing to write her name. What the tin bought was 45 days. What the 45 days bought was a name on a drum. She signed the final test sheet, pressed the red inspection mark of the works on the head of the drum beside her own signature, and hung the brass key on a nail on the testing room wall next to the ledger, where anyone coming in could see both. Then they opened the loading doors, and the crane took the accepted cable out to the barge, 600 yards of it, made by people whose names were written down.